With the release of Rebel Moon Part 2 The Scargiver, I'm going to rank all 11 Zack Snyder movies. Now just for clarification, I'm not ranking the director's cuts, I'm just ranking the original theatrically released movie. The only director's cut I am ranking is Zack Snyder's Justice League, because we all know he didn't write the original. So, without further ado, let's begin. In last place, you have Sucker Punch. Now, the action's cool, at least there's a story here, but it's nothing. The action in this movie is not even part of the story. Yes, it looks cool, but there's no point of it being in here. The story is dull, the characters are dull, and there's no reason for me to care about anything that's happening in this movie, as it's not fleshed out. There's almost nothing interesting in this movie, which, as we'll see, every time Zack Snyder writes a movie, most of the time Zack Snyder writes a movie, it's not great. And mostly these bottom ones are movies that Zack Snyder wrote. In 10th place, you have Rebel Moon Part 1, The Child of Fire. Again, same thing with Sucker Punch. Unnecessary characters, action's cool, story is dull again. We've seen the story before, we've seen it millions of times. That sell point of this is Zack Snyder's version of Star Wars, this is not it, because Netflix forced Zack Snyder to make two versions of the film. The PG-13 version and the director's cut. The director's cut is what we were promised, but instead we were stuck with this movie. So, once we get the director's cut, we finally know the full story, but when it comes to this movie, they introduce many plot points, many characters, but never pay it off. Now, the story threads make sense because it's a part 1, but the character threads, they introduce a character with this unique ability, but then that character is basically not in the movie for the rest of it, and there's no point of gathering all these characters up when you're only using about 2 of those characters. And this movie just comes off as dull, not really enjoyable. It's not what we were promised. In 9th place, you have Army of the Dead. Now, this movie frustrates me because at some parts, I really love what they're doing. A heist zombie movie, that's like a really good idea right there. But then, the runtime comes into play. This movie's almost 3 hours, I think. It's either that or 2.5 hours. And only about 45 minutes of this movie I actually liked. The other, about the rest of the movie, was boring. Because it's just these characters walking around with almost nothing happening. And this movie frustrates me because those scenes happen. I was thinking of just stopping the movie and watching it the next day of how bored I was. But then when the stuff actually happens with all the zombies and all those 40 minutes that I like, I really enjoyed it. But since this movie has those boring scenes that are just dull, the movie comes off the same way. But at the same time, if I were to rewatch this movie, it will be for those scenes I did like, and I will skip the rest. At the 8th place, you have Legend of the Guardians. Now, before rewatching this movie, I did not want to rewatch it. Because when I first watched it, I hated it. It was awful. This time around, it's a lot better. I was surprised of how better this movie was. The action is cool. That's what makes this movie entertaining, especially the final act with the slow motion scenes. But again, story's dull. It's not great. Characters are dull. But it makes for a entertaining enough movie. It's just, by the end, you're kind of sick of it and just want it to be over. But for the most part, you can enjoy it, but it's not great. I wouldn't really recommend it either. In 7th place, you have Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Now, a lot of people don't like this movie. For me, yes, it's not good. But the action in the last hour of this movie really saves it because there's at least enjoyment in there that wasn't in Part 1. I really enjoyed what they did with the action scenes with all the slow motion in there. But then when we get to the first half, some lazy storytelling. Because there's one scene where these characters sit around in a circle and talk about their trauma that they went through.
That's just lazy writing.
And you get to see that throughout the entire movie. It's really hard to care for any of these characters for what is happening. And the movie comes off as dull again, just like Part 1. But you can enjoy it more due to the action scene. But in 6th place, you have 300. Now, for a point of reference, everything from this point forward, I would recommend. So, when it comes to 300, cool action scenes. I really like what they did with everything, all the slow motion scenes, all the story. I enjoyed all of that. It's just my main problem with this movie was that there was a narrator throughout it all. Now that wouldn't really be a problem, but I didn't really like the way Zack Snyder used the narrator in here, and it kind of interrupted the story, in my opinion. But I enjoyed everything else. I liked the plot of this, and I really enjoyed it. In 5th place, we have Man of Steel. Now, I'm not in love with Man of Steel as much as other people are, but I love all the ideas they have in here. It's just my main problem with this movie is that it's in the universe. Because it got rebooted, but it's in the universe of DC movies. Movie's plot doesn't really make sense when we know Wonder Woman exists, Batman exists, The Flash exists, Cyborg exists. That's where this movie kind of halts for me. But if you don't really think of it in a universe, I do really like this movie. But because of that, it's kind of stopping me from really engaging with it. In 4th place, we have Dawn of the Dead. This movie was awesome. I loved all the zombie action in here. I loved it all. I loved all that. And this movie came off as awesome. For Zack Snyder's first movie, he executed it really well. And I loved everything they did in here. And just the way Zack Snyder presented all these zombies and just the plot in general. In 3rd place, you have Watchmen. Now, I didn't really know what this movie was. And then it turns out it's based on the comic book. So I watched it. And I also enjoyed this one as well. I want to see these characters more. I feel like there's a lot more story you can tell with this. But I know the movie wasn't well received, so we're probably not getting a sequel. But I would love to see a sequel to this movie. And most of the movie spends time introducing these characters. The Watchmen aren't really up together, which is, for me, the way the movie works, it doesn't really matter. But I kind of wish they do. I kind of wish they worked together more, because this is a 3-hour movie, and for them to barely be together, there's a lot more stuff you could have done. This movie as a show, though, could have worked a lot more, because they could have told more stories, which is why there is a show of this. But for this movie alone, I feel like you could have made it into a show. It would have worked a lot better, but I did enjoy the final project of the movie. In 2nd place, you have Batman vs. Superman. Yes, I actually like the actual version of this film. It might help because I actually seen the director's cut first and then watched the original version of the film, which is that comparison right there. I kind of know the completed, more better version of the movie first. Yes, the original version does have problems. I still enjoy it. I love this movie still. It's a great setup to Zack Snyder's Justice League, which we will talk about in a second. But yeah, I loved everything to do with this movie. This is one of those movies that I will never understand the hate for. And I still really like this movie. But number 1 for me, no surprise at all, is Zack Snyder's Justice League. This movie fixes all of the problems that the original Justice League had and made it better. This is Zack Snyder's version. This is not Joss Whedon's version that Warner Bros. Made Zack Snyder's name attached to it. This is the real Zack Snyder's Justice League. It's 4 hours, so we don't have to rush into the 2-hour mark. This is exactly what the movie needs to be. It does it all perfectly, setting up Darkseid, Steppenwolf, all of that. And when you get to the final action scenes too, so much better. This movie fixes everything in an amazing... But with that was my ranking of all 11 Zack Snyder movies. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, maybe these ones on the side will interest you too. And see you guys later. Goodbye.